Do you recall having any conversation about killing Nicole, even if you didn't mean it seriously?
None, absolutely none, ever.
Patrolmen come, a horrific scene, two dead people, as we said, Nicole Brown, Ron Goldman, a lot of blood. And homicide detectives get called out.
You start looking at what evidence is available, and you certainly should be looking for any exculpatory evidence that may lead you in a different direction. You don't start with assumptions, you start with the evidence. In this case, like Lang said, and the other investigators, there was nothing to lead them in a different direction. Nothing.
The story of Jill Shively, the woman who lived in Brentwood, and she was driving her Volkswagen Bug, and OJ Simpson almost collided with her in the white Bronco. You know, blocks, let's say this, blocks from the murder scene, a speeding white Ford Bronco with no lights on almost hits her and comes to a stop in the intersection. And somehow there's another car involved now who's blocking the intersection. And how does she know it's OJ? Because the windows rolled down and he's yelling at the other motorist. And she says, oh, that's the guy from Naked Gun.
This woman is one of the most credible witnesses.
100%.
Yes, and one of the most essential pieces of evidence.
Yeah.
How do you plan to have leather slide over latex gloves? So as this was unfolding, I'm sitting there in front of my television thinking, no kidding, they won't fit.
Yeah.
They wouldn't fit if his hands were half the size now. And all that did was play into the prosecution, which resulted in the world famous, if they don't fit, you must have quit. And it's like, duh.
Chief, big day today. Big day today, Chief. It's a, let's call it a dual platform podcast, right?
Yes, very exciting.
On your podcast, Your Leo Nation. It's going to be on Truth Nation. And when we're doing something like that, you know it's important, Mark. So what is the topic today?
The topic is the infamous OJ Simpson and things that surround the story of OJ Simpson.
Yeah, definitely, you know, at the time and we're getting to jump ahead a little bit, but just some important facts. At the time he went to trial for the murder of Nicole Brown and Ron Goldman, it was, Mark, the longest criminal trial in the history of the state of California. And I don't think there's been one longer since. I could be wrong about that. But, you know, crazy trial. Turning back the clock to 1994. So what was interesting is the case really changed a lot in the criminal justice system. And part of that, I guess this was kind of the first big criminal trial after the Rodney King case in Los Angeles. That had something to do with it. What I point out that a lot of people may not be aware of in this case is the impact that video evidence has. In fact, I would argue that there's a videotape that no one really talks about that I think was key in getting the acquittal for OJ Simpson. We'll talk about that, how that was something kind of new at that time, video evidence, and using it to refute what the police say happened.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that was a big part of obviously the Rodney King case, right?
Correct.
So turning back the clock, Mark, to 1994, June 1994. And by the way, we're doing this now. You know, I think we had kind of planned to do it, or at least I had, on the 30th, around the 30th anniversary of the murders, which is, I don't know, June 12th, I think.
June 12th, 1994.
It's coming up, only about a month away. But then with OJ Simpson passing a couple of weeks ago, you know, hey, it's in the news. Why not talk about it now? Why not put it out there? We were both kind of in the same place in our careers, Mark. I think you probably were a California highway patrolman for about 3 years at that time.
That's right. I remember exactly where it was, but about 3 years.
And I was a DEA agent for 2 years. We were both in LA, kind of getting immersed in the criminal justice system. It was an impactful case on me because I don't know, we'll talk about it as we go through it. I'll just say that for now. An impactful case on me. I'm sure it was for you too. before we get into a little bit of the timeline of what happened, to remind people, just give me like, one or two thoughts you have back then. Like, what do you remember about that time, about when the murders first happened?
Yeah, I remember exactly where I was. I mean, almost to the minute when I first heard about this, and that was the morning of June 13th. I had just finished my graveyard shift, and get off about 6:30 in the morning or so, and I'm getting in my my patrol car, getting in my personal vehicle to go home at about just about 7 in the morning. Turn
Mhm.
the radio on like I always do, turn the news on, and everything is about these two murders. And the funny thing is, Bill, the focus at the time, and I think understandably, was the the death of OJ Simpson's ex-wife. That was kind of the headline, and about her companion, her friend, her house guest, whatever it was. Um, and I don't even know if they had his Ron Goldman's name at the time, but that was the focus. Was about the death of Nicole Brown Simpson, OJ Simpson's wife, ex-wife, and there was no focus, at least immediately, about OJ Simpson.
Hmm. Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I don't remember exactly where I was. The thing that really impacted me, or that I remember about it, and I'm sure a lot of other people do too, is I think it was closer to June 17th when OJ was supposed to turn himself in and didn't show, and there was the infamous low speed chase in the Bronco. By the way, not OJ's Bronco,
Yes, isn't that
Al
funny?
Cowling's Bronco.
Yes.
They had matching Broncos. That's funny how it became like synonymous with OJ's Bronco, although they were, identical. It wasn't his. It was AC who was driving. So
Mhm.
turn back the clock, Mark. June 1994, June 10th, Bundy, the condominium or the townhouse where Nicole Brown lived. Um, Crazy dog barking at night. I think eventually the neighbors. I don't think the bodies were discovered there, Mark, until after midnight. So it really would have been what, the
13th.
13th then,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yep.
So patrolmen come, a horrific scene, two dead people, as we said, Nicole Brown, Ron Goldman, a lot of blood. And homicide detectives get called out. The team, the main IO or investigating officer was Tom Lang,
Mhm.
and his partner was Phil Van Adder. Um, I think, I don't think that the detectives actually got there till probably closer to 5 o'clock in the morning, somewhere between maybe 3:30, 5 o'clock in the morning. By the time they got the call and went out there, they were also working with two other detectives. One's last name was Phillips. I don't remember his last name, Mark. I don't know if you knew him or remember him. And the
No,
other was
you know
Mark
what?
Firm.
And I hadn't thought about Phillips. I remember his name now. I don't remember his first
Yeah,
name, but that rings a
yeah.
bell.
And
Mhm.
Mark Furhman, of course. I think we all remember him.
Yep.
They worked it together. Now, I don't know if Mark Furhman was new to the unit or just maybe they had never. I know it's like a 16 or so. The way LAPD works, or worked at that time at least, was they had RHD, Robbery Homicide Division,
Mhm.
kind of like a headquarters element, let's call it, where high profile um, homicide cases were handled. So there's homicide detectives throughout the city, but something that's high profile, or maybe it's going to be like an example, a serial killing or something like that, they may pick it up and do the investigation. Maybe more seasoned investigators, more experienced investigators. I know there's maybe 15 or 20 detectives, at least at that time, on that team. And I don't know if Furman was new, but I remember back at that time, Tom Lang saying he hadn't worked with Mark Furman before on
Mhm.
a case, didn't know him too well. But anyway, they get to the scene and they then go over to what's called Rockingham, right? That's OJ Simpson's house. And Mark, if I miss something or jump over something that you want to mention, just interrupt me.
No, not at
But
all.
they
I'm
get,
appreciating the education, the refresher course
yeah,
here, but go ahead.
well, I mean, listen, people, there's a lot of people that 30 years, I mean, yeah, what is it?
Almost
30
almost
years ago. Yeah,
30
30
years
years ago,
ago,
like I said.
almost.
So a lot of people weren't even around then. All they know is kind of, maybe what some clips that are been on lately because OJ passed away, but there's a lot to this case. So Lang and Furman go over to Rockingham. I'm not sure if any of the other detectives went over there, and they can't, they're ringing the bell. It's a gated property. So it's in Brentwood, California, suburbs of LA. You ever work West LA, Mark?
No. Well, I take it back.
Okay.
I did work West LA actually for years as a lieutenant. And, but again, it wasn't cop work. I was pushing paper, so I didn't get out much. But yep, I was
Right.
in the area that would have covered.
Yeah. An affluent neighborhood, I guess you would say, right?
Yes,
This area of Brentwood,
extremely.
a gated property. So they're at the gate and they can't get in the driveway gate. No one's answering. They're hitting the buzzer, whatever. They see a light on in the house, but um, nothing's happening now. According to the detectives, and this is where you know, it gets interesting. Let's say that. According to detectives, they felt that, hey, we saw OJ's wife dead, Nicole Brown dead, someone else dead at her property. We started to think maybe he was injured or incapacitated or something inside the house. So
Mhm.
they made the decision to go over the wall. So Mark Furhman went over the wall at the property, let them in, and they went to the main house, rang the doorbell, whatever, no one answers. And there's a couple little cottages or guest houses on the property. And they went to two of those. I think there was actually three of them, if I'm remembering right. They kind of split up, went to the different guest properties. And the first one, Cato Caitlin answers the door, who lived in that cottage. And then another one was OJ's daughter, Arnell Simpson.
Yes. Uh-huh.
She lived in a guest house there too. So they're talking to Cato. Arnell gets a key to go in the main house. Now, what's interesting is, remember, and it's kind of little things like this where if it's nothing at the time, Mark, but in law enforcement, things that are seemingly inconsequential, that, a big deal can be made of them later. So one of the first questions that Mark Furhman asked Cato Caitlin is, where's the clothes he wore last night? Right?
Yeah.
Now, if you're entering the property to check on OJ, are you, is that, I guess what I'm saying is that statement that they're entering the property to check on OJ, does that jive with then encountering Cato and asking him what clothes he wore last night? What do you
Yeah.
think?
So it's when you look at the totality here, we have a 30,000-foot view, a 30-year
Mhm,
perspective, things like this. Like you said, Bill, almost any argument can be made on almost any piece of evidence, almost.
mhm,
And the first thing I want to say, I want to be completely transparent about this, even at the time, so to speak, a week later or a week later, a while afterwards, when we found out that LAPD had gone over the wall for what we would call a welfare check. Hey, we're going to go
mhm,
check on OJ because his ex-wife's been murdered and things like this. We can't get a hold of him. This is kind of suspicious as far as a safety issue is concerned. Look, anybody who's been in law enforcement, quite frankly, who reads lots of stories of domestic violence, or the murder of spouses, we all know. I mean, just statistically speaking, whether we like it or not, it's more than likely to be the husband or boyfriend that has committed the crime. Not always, I'm not saying always, but we all know that more than likely the odds are. It's just the way it goes. Um, and so for LAPD detectives from robbery homicide to say that they only went over the wall for a welfare check for
mhm.
OJ, I won't call it disingenuous, but
Yeah.
I don't think it's completely accurate. Let's put it that way. I
Mhm.
think the more accurate statement was, listen, we've been in this job for a long time. We've done this, whatever. And yep, we went in without a warrant because we thought that at least a person of interest might get away. Would that have
Right.
stood up in court? Would they have lost evidence? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. But I think that would have been a more accurate statement. Now, as far as asking uh, Cato about what clothes he wore last night, once you're over there and you're on the property and you encounter somebody, um, in other words, I don't think from that point, from an investigative point of view, where you start actually gathering information, gathering statements, um, um, to start putting a case together in many levels as a witness, a potential suspect. So I don't think there's anything wrong with asking that, but again, this goes to the totality of the situation. So that's where I leave it. Asking for about what clothes you wore last night, I don't have a problem with that. I have a little more of a problem with them saying that was strictly a welfare check for going over the wall.
Right. That's what I was getting at earlier too. I mean, we've been there, and that's it is what it is. Um, so they talked to OJ, and at some point, I'm sorry, they talked to Cato. At some point, Cato mentions hearing like a noise, bumping into the wall or something like that,
Three
and
bumps, 3 bumps. He
three
said.
bumps.
Mhm.
So Furhman goes, to follow up on that, right? Furhman goes outside around, I guess, the back of the cottage or somewhere adjacent to the cottage and the house, and he finds the infamous glove. He's by himself when he finds it. They recover the glove from there. The glove turns out to have blood from OJ, blood from Nicole, and blood from Ron Goldman on it. All three people on the glove. The glove is found on the property at Rockingham. By this time, Arnell had opened the door to the house, and the police had gone in. Kind of, when I say the police, the detectives kind of cleared the house or determined no one was there. And at some point, they saw blood in the house. They saw blood drops in the house, and it was a trail that they could follow. The way I guess it was explained by Lang is the blood tails, meaning when someone is walking and blood is dripping from their body, it will elongate in the direction they're walking, almost form like, think of it like a tear shape, a drop, and then it splatters forward. So they could see that this blood was coming from someone who walked into the house, and they followed that blood trail backwards, and it went out, across the property, out to the Ford Bronco in the street. Sometime around then, Mark, they decided we better get a search warrant, right? Uh, and they got a search warrant for the property. Anything about that blood evidence or that blood stuff that I talked about that I'm missing, Mark, or that you think is like real pertinent there?
Well, I don't think there's anything you're missing that, like you said, is pertinent. Uh, we could talk about the physical evidence for hours and hours in this
Yeah.
case because there's so much of it. I think one of the aspects of this blood evidence, again, I don't want to get ahead of this discussion,
Hmm.
but obviously, Mark Furman becomes a really it becomes so much leverage for the defense later in the trial, and one of the aspects of that is the accusation that he may have planted the glove
Hmm.
at the Rockingham estate.
Hmm.
And the way I want to address that, Bill, is when you talk about that possibility, we'll use that word, the possibility that Mark Furman or anybody else for that matter planted that glove. There are a lot of pieces to that I don't think were explored very well in the trial and by the prosecution. But if the glove was planted and OJ did not commit this crime, what that would mean is instantly and completely all of the other evidence would have had to have been planted in the sense of the blood evidence in his house. In other words, either he was at the scene or he was not.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
if the glove wasn't his, then that means he wasn't there, obviously. And then all the blood. So you have Van Adder and maybe Phillips and Lang, Furman. Everybody would have had to have been in on the conspiracy to frame OJ with all of this blood. By the way, that they had to have collected at the scene all of the blood from all three victims, and then bring it over to OJ's estate in Rockingham, and then plant the blood. So this is where, I start listening as just an observer. I start thinking this case against OJ was extremely compelling because the number of people you would have to have involved in order to frame him for whatever reason, I don't know, would be substantial at the least.
Yeah, and I think when we get to the point of talking about the trial and the acquittal, I think um, the prosecuting attorneys, a lot of this probably lays on their lap. I mean, there were mistakes all around, Mark, and part of it was just what was happening in the world at this time, and things that were in the jury's mind. but but yeah, it was the prosecutors decided to really bank on the DNA evidence and not really even introduce some of the other evidence that was out there. So back to the scene at Rockingham, I think Lang calls OJ, who's in Chicago. He had flown to Chicago the night before. And you know what? The one thing that I remember about that is what Lang said is that OJ didn't even ask about the kids, right? So OJ, he and Nicole had children that lived with Nicole at the Bundy Street, condo or townhouse. There was, you're calling someone telling him that his ex-wife died and he has kids with her. He doesn't even ask about the kids. And I don't know, Lang made it sound like he didn't even ask really how it happened.
Exactly. That
Right?
was
Am
the
I right
point I
about
wanted
that?
to make. He didn't
Yeah.
ask how it happened. And I would love for everybody watching and listening to this podcast to do your best to put yourself in this incredibly traumatic situation. You get a phone call about a loved one who has died, whose life has been taken. We'll just say who's died. And you don't ask what happened. In other words, put yourself in that state of mind as best you can. You get a call and you don't ask, well, what happened? How did they die? Was it a medical incident? Was it a car crash? Was it, were they killed? Were they murdered? Nothing about that. I've made, I don't know how many death notifications. I don't know
Mhm.
how many death notifications.
Mhm.
And when you walk to someone's front door at 2:00 in the morning, knock on the door, you
Oh, yep,
listen, my name's, Officer Garrett, Sergeant Garrett,
yep.
Lieutenant Garrett, whatever it is, and I need to sit down with you and give you some bad news. And so you tell them almost every time, and they see California Highway Patrol. So I mean, most people think, okay, it's probably a traffic accident, but they still say, what happened? They ask
Right,
specific questions. Where was it? How did it happen? Did he live for a long? Did she live? Did she die? I mean, all these specifics. OJ did none of that. I
right.
think that's another. It's so telling. I'm so glad you brought that up, Bill.
That's very telling. I mean, hey, I'm always cautious, Mark, as using someone's reaction to something as quote evidence, unquote. But it is telling, man. You can tell something at least about someone by how they react to something like that, and that's really at the least it's extremely strange that he wouldn't ask any questions about it and just came back home. So I think Lang actually went back to the Bundy location, took that crime scene over. Van Adder was kind of running the Rockingham crime scene, and OJ got back relatively quickly. So it was sometime the afternoon after later in that day. Let's say it like that. He got back to LA
Mhm.
later in the day, and I remember the interview, the first interview that Lang did with him. It lasted 32 minutes.
Mhm.
And I just remember the 32 minutes because that was OJ's number playing football, number 32. So I always remember that it was 32 minutes. And I think, I think I think Lang said it just in that interview, he had three different excuses for how he cut we didn't talk about that. So OJ had a cut on his finger. And even
No,
on the
no. He had
recorded,
2 cuts, 2
oh, okay.
fingers.
Okay, 2
Yeah.
cuts, and even on the interview, which was recorded, Lang obviously made a point to say, "I see you have cuts on your fingers, you're bleeding, do you wanna get a Band-Aid or something?" And he said, "No, no, I'm fine, I'm fine." Um, that's strange, to have a couple different excuses. I think you don't you what were the excuses, Mark? I've heard you mention it
The
before.
first one was, I may have, uh, chronology wrong here, but one of the excuses was that, um, he often nicked he goes, "I play a lot of golf. I play a lot of golf." And I'll try to find the actual statement. I have some things pulled up here.
Mhm.
"I play a lot of golf, and that happens a lot." Um and this is Mark speaking now. So for those of you who play a lot of golf, we all know how often you cut your fingers playing golf. But that was one of his excuses. And then he said that when he was in Chicago and got the phone call about Nicole's death, that he had a little bit of a fit breakdown kind of thing, and he broke a drinking glass, a water glass in the sink, and he goes, maybe that reopened the cuts.
Mm.
And I have the transcript here from the interview, and I'm paraphrasing, but that's in essence what he said. So we all have cut ourselves, and if you look at we can post those. We can look if you look at the photograph of the incisions, the cuts on his knuckles, they're not insignificant. And I think for anybody who's cut themselves to the point where you're actually dripping blood, we all remember how we did it. We all
Hmm.
remember how we cut ourselves. Um, and to not to be able to remember and then try to explain it away with multiple different explanations, that's redundant, but explaining in different ways, to me, like you said before, we don't want to attribute guilt to someone's reaction, behavior, but all of these things add up. They all are pieces to a larger picture. So there's a weird reaction to the notification, and then we can't explain how we've cut two of our knuckles on, by the way, on our non-weapon hand, our non-strong hand.
Yeah, great point. So it was the right hand glove that Furhman found at Rockingham, right? And it was
Uh,
the
I
left hand glove. Am I right about that?
I believe so. I
Yeah.
think the one at Rockingham had the cuts in it.
Um, well,
I believe.
so here's what they thought, because the question, here's what I know, I should say. I know that whatever glove was left behind at the scene, that's the hand that he had the cuts on.
Okay.
Because one of the questions was, hey, were there cuts in the glove that matched where the cuts in the fingers were? And the answer is no. There were cuts in the glove, but they did not match up exactly. So the theory is that in the struggle at Bundy, in a struggle probably with Ron Goldman, his left hand glove came off, and after it came off, he cut himself with the knife. That's what the theory is about what happened, and that glove was left behind, and he left the scene. Um, talking about the amount of evidence in this case, Lang, who's done a lot of homicide cases, I mean, a pretty well respected, very well, not pretty, a very well respected LAPD homicide investigator, right?
Hmm.
He says as far as like a difficult case, this is not even top 10.
Right.
As far as a difficult case to solve, there was so much circumstantial evidence. And he said this is one of the only cases he's ever had, or a few cases, where there was almost nothing or literally nothing exculpatory that was found. In other words, a lot of times in an
Right.
investigation, a fact or something will come to light that may not really jive with the rest of the evidence or what you think happened, what the theory of the crime is. Everything they found kind of put the puzzle together. There were no facts that really that pointed to anything other than OJ Simpson being the suspect or the murderer in the case.
Well, that's exactly
So
right. That's
yeah,
anyway. I just want to fall. That's exactly
yeah,
right. There wasn't anything, at least from my point of view, doing criminal investigations, traffic investigations, which are all the same basic process. You start looking at what evidence is available, and you certainly should be looking for any exculpatory evidence that may lead you in a different direction. You don't start with assumptions; you start with the evidence. In this case, like Lang said, and the other investigators, there was nothing to lead them in a different direction. Nothing.
yeah. Now, a couple things which really, I don't know, they may go more to how the trial was handled or what happened at the trial, but they're worth noting because these are a couple facts that didn't weren't used at trial, so people may not know them, right?
Hmm.
The first one is the story of Jill Shively, the woman who lived in Brentwood, and she was driving her Volkswagen Bug, and OJ Simpson almost collided with her in the white Bronco. What was it, about 10:30 or whatever time the murders
About, yeah,
probably?
10:30
Yeah.
ish. I think she said between, she wasn't sure, 10:50 or 10:30, 10:45, or 10:15 and 10:30, but in that area. Hmm.
So here's what the facts that she put forward, Mark. The white Ford Bronco, no lights on. See, I have the exact streets here. You may know better
Uh,
than me.
I actually
So
have it
so
here. Um,
Uh, East on San Vicente approaching Bundy, and you got it. I get it. If you're not in West LA, that doesn't mean anything to you. But
yeah.
um, blocks. Let's say this: blocks from the murder scene, a speeding white Ford Bronco with no lights on almost hits her and comes to a stop in the intersection. And somehow there's another car involved now who's blocking the intersection. And how does she know it's OJ? Because the windows rolled down and he's yelling at the other motorist. And she says, "Oh, that's the guy from Naked Gun," or whatever the movie was that he had just done, which
Mhm.
was I think out in theaters or had just been out in theaters.
Yeah, I mean, a few
And
years before, but it's pretty famous.
okay,
Yeah.
so in her mind, she even writes down what she thinks is the license plate. I think she transposes a couple digits on it or something like that.
Mhm.
What does she do when she gets home? She calls the police and she reports a drunk driver, a drunk OJ driving the white Ford Bronco. And there's a discussion about, well, did he hit you? Were you involved in an accident? Like, what exactly are you reporting here? And Mark, how would that work when someone's back then, not
Mhm.
today, but how would that work back then when someone's making a call? Now, I get it. This is LAPD. This isn't Highway Patrol.
Right.
But when someone's making a call to report a drunk driver, when there's no um, accident or what would have happened to that? Because I guess
Well,
it was recorded and they
yeah.
had a record of it, but how would that normally be handled? Any idea?
Yeah, I can tell what goes on today. Again, 3.5 years ago since I retired, but generally what happens if we get a call, and now you have to understand, back then cell phones were this is why she had to call when she got home,
Right,
because most people didn't have cell phones in their cars at the
right.
time. Now the 911 calls about impaired drivers are ubiquitous. They happen all day long, or certainly all night long, but all day long as well. And but what would happen today if the highway patrol gets a 911 call behind a drunk driver? The first thing is, of course, they say, listen, don't follow the driver because we don't want you to be involved in an accident and for your safety. License plate, direction, speed, and things like this. And the way we'll see if we get a unit in the area to intercept this vehicle, and that's probable cause enough right there. If we have a citizen calling in, this person's weaving all over the place or driving erratically, then the CHP can make a stop just based on that, do an investigation, and take the appropriate enforcement action if it's needed at all. But back then, this person had to go home, use her landline, and call it in. There's not much any law enforcement agency can do at that point because we have no idea where
Mhm.
this person was driving. Even if you get a license plate, you still have to put someone behind the wheel. So an officer has to see them driving the car for the most part. There are a lot of exceptions, but I'm being general
Right.
here for time's sake. So there's not much that they're going to do. They're not going to go over to the person's house, knock on the door where you're driving your car, because it's a very difficult case to make for a misdemeanor DUI. So that's about what happened. But I do want to talk about this, or just say
Mhm.
this. This And there are a couple of things, Bill. This is one of them. This woman is one of the most, to me, most credible witnesses, and
100%.
yes, and one of the most essential pieces of evidence, because there was nothing in this person, as far as we know. There's no motivation other than, hey, there's someone dangerous out on the highway, and I'm hoping that you guys, LAPD, can prevent him from causing harm to someone else. The only
Mhm.
motivation from this lady's point of view was a public safety motivation. That was it. It was completely pure. It wasn't after the fact. She didn't call the DA after OJ got arrested. Hey, I saw some things that night, because those things may not be as credible after the fact.
Mhm.
This was before anything was known about these murders, and she puts a white Bronco with a guy who looks like OJ within the vicinity during the time frame of these murders.
She even said she recognized his voice when he was
Oh,
yelling at the other motorist.
mhm,
She even said she recognized his voice from TV commercials and from the movie that he did.
yeah,
So she then that's a great point, Mark, that I remember the police even commented to her when they maybe I should go in the right order here. So late I guess the next morning she's talking to her mother or some relative, and she learns about the murders. And she says, man, that's interesting because I saw OJ just down the block from there. And then she calls the police back and leaves like another message for them or something. And they end up coming out and interviewing her, contacting her. And to this day, she has the business card from the police officer with the license plate of the Bronco on there that she wrote down, that day. When she was talking to him, I guess she wrote the license plate down on it or something. She had written it down. By the way, in the car, she had written the license plate on a piece of paper, what she thought the license plate was. And that's a great point, that she had no motive. She had no criminal history. The police even commented to her, like, you've never even, when they came out to interview her, they said, hey, we do a kind of a background before we even came out here. Like, you've never even gotten a parking ticket. What's your story? What happened? So extremely credible. They didn't use her at trial because she sold her story to hard copy for $5,000, Mark, and that pissed off Marsha Clark. But I think sometimes you just have to say, hey, we're going to eat it. We'll eat that part of it at trial.
That's right.
You at least have the very important fact, which you mentioned, which is she called before anyone even knew there was a murder. She called the police to report that he was in the area, not only before he was a suspect in a murder, before anyone even knew there was a murder. So I think
Yeah.
incredibly important. The other piece of evidence that was never used, I don't remember the guy's name, Skip something, at LAX. The person who sees OJ buy a trash can, you remember this one? And
Yeah,
he's
it's coming
taking
back to me.
items out of a bag and he's
Right.
throwing them in the trash can at LAX. And Caitlin later says, like, the bag that witness described was one of the bags that went into the limo, which we skipped over, but the limo had come to pick up OJ to take him to the airport. OJ wasn't answering the bell. There's no Ford Bronco there. The limo driver drives around the block, gives it some time. 15 minutes later, the Bronco's there, and he makes contact with him and picks him up. So when they're loading the limo to go to the airport, Caitlin's there, and he goes to pick up this bag, and OJ says, "No, don't touch that. I'll get that."
Mhm.
And OJ takes that bag, puts it in the limo, and then at the airport, there's a witness that sees him with that bag, taking things out of it, dumping them in the trash. And by the way, the murder weapon, Mark, never found, right?
Right.
The clothing that he wore, never found. So it was disposed of somewhere, and probably at LAX before he ever even got on the plane. And man, I guess this is pre-TSA also, Mark. The fact that you could show up at the airport like 20 minutes before a flight and even make the flight, I think is
Yeah.
something that people today won't what is it, like an 11 o'clock, 11:15 flight,
I
and he
I
didn't leave
I
his
I think, right around there. I think it was just before midnight was the flight, but
okay,
pretty close. And the drive that night from Brentwood down to LAX is probably being pretty quick.
mhm,
I'd say maybe, Bill, maybe you can make it in 25 minutes, you think, from Brentwood down to
right,
LAX, give or take.
right,
Something I want to say about this, about credible witnesses, and you touched on it with the limo driver. He is another person who I find, I mean, a lot of people won't say gloss over it, but his testimony, Bill, it wasn't very, you know, salacious or uh, intriguing, but I think it was so solid. And his testimony is that he had gotten there in time, the time that he was supposed to get there to pick up OJ to take him to the airport, and he rang the gate bell once, twice, three times, and OJ, no one answered. And eventually, and by the way, when he pulled up, he saw no Bronco outside. There was no Bronco in the street when the limo driver got there. He testified to that. And after a while, I can't remember the time frame now. I want to say it's 10:45, something like this. He sees someone crossing the driveway. He can see into the property. Sees someone
that's right,
crossing a driveway in the property who appears to be about 6 feet tall. And this is almost the same time that Cato Kalin testifies that he hears the noise up against his wall there in the property. So you have these two independent people testifying that they either saw or heard something or someone at the same time. And what's so important here is that when the limo driver pulls up to the property, there's no Bronco, because if you look at the property, you can go on the website, you go on the internet and see the property, see the map. From where the limo driver pulled up, he's coming down one street, he can see the other street, and there's no Bronco there. But the next day, or later that night, early the morning the next day, the detectives find the Bronco parked on, I think it's on Rockingham, but either street there. It wasn't there according to the limo driver. Again, here's someone with there's no motivation here that I could discern other than, hey, here's what I saw, take it or leave it.
Right.
And when you add up no Bronco on the street, the same time parked on the street, the same time the other lady says that she sees OJ Simpson and recognizes his voice a few minutes down the street. This is some of the most compelling evidence to me, because these are independent, unrelated witnesses that are putting OJ close to the murder scene, not at his house during the murder scene. And I know I'm long-winded here, but I want people to think about this from a pretty logical point of view. The fact that you're not at your house doesn't mean you're near or at the murder scene. But when you're near the murder scene, at the time the murders were decided they happened from the coroner's report, and another witness says you're not at home, this is a double whammy. This is compelling evidence, and I think as strong as any DNA evidence, quite frankly.
I would even argue it's a triple whammy, Mark, because he told the limo driver that he overslept, insinuating that he was actually home the whole time.
Yes,
And
he lied to the
so
limo
not
driver.
only was he not home and he was seen at close to the murder scene, but he lied about where he was.
100%. I'm
yeah,
glad you
pretty-
brought that up.
pretty-
It's actually in my notes, and I forgot to say it because I talked too much.
Right, right. So, what I think, what's the next thing, Mark? The slow speed chase. You know, the agreement that what do you think that so OJ was supposed to had made an agreement to turn himself in. I think the detectives really wanted to go out and just arrest him, kind of low key.
Yeah.
But the brass apparently decided to have him come downtown to Parker Center, turn himself in, and he no-showed. Right. And I remember the news that day. They were kind of statements about, where is he? He's a fugitive. He hasn't showed up. And somehow, I got to get your perspective on this, because CHP was following him most of the time, right?
Yeah,
Mark?
Orange
When
County
he was-
Sheriff started in CHP. Matter of fact, the highway patrol officer, and I don't think I knew him at the time, but there was a highway patrol officer who got in the chase and was the first person over the wall into OJ's yard. You can watch that video from any number of sources. But yeah, we were involved.
So, do you remember how he was actually located in Orange County in the car?
There
was
were
it
some
phone calls that he was making, or what was it?
I think there's some because, in other words, there was a press conference that was reluctantly done. I watched an interview with he was an LAPD commander. I forget his name, but he was in charge at this point of the media relations with all of this, and he reluctantly held a press conference to announce that OJ had not turned himself in. And I think one of the reasons he reluctantly, I say reluctantly, in other words, he was kind of embarrassed, and he said that in the interview, because this all kind of fell apart, and he thought it was egg on the face of LAPD. And by the way, I don't think this was all LAPD's fault at all, but that's a different story. But once this became broadcast and public information, they made a big deal about it. If I remember correctly, a citizen called it in, said, I see OJ's Bronco on the 405, the 91, wherever it was. That's my recollection. I didn't look that part up, but that's how I remember it.
Okay. And do you remember how long did that thing go on for? Was it a couple
Well,
hours
it was
before
supposed to
he
be,
got
I
back
would say probably an hour or so, Bill.
Yeah, yeah.
give or take.
Followed back to Rockingham, and there was a suicide note. I don't know where that suicide note was found. Do you know where the suicide note was left, or how that
I
came
don't
in?
remember either. I know that AC Collins was saying that OJ has a gun to his head, and I don't remember. I'm pretty certain that the suicide note was found in the Bronco, but that's just me kind of speculating. My memory's not that great from 30 years ago.
Right. So back at Rockingham, the Bronco goes back there. How did that thing wrap up, Mark? I don't even remember. They finally talked him into to
Coming
coming out of the
outside.
car, or what?
Yeah, because I think he'd gone to the house. They finally talked him into coming outside. And then I can't remember how. Actually, it was quite some time because they didn't get him down to Parker Center, and Parker Center is LAPD headquarters. They just rebuilt it and moved across the street kind of a couple of years ago. But Parker Center, right in the heart of downtown Los Angeles, and so it's a good little drive from Brentwood to Parker Center. But they got him down there late at night
Mhm.
after they talked him into surrendering.
Hey, let me ask you something. Back to him not turning himself in, and you said it probably wasn't LAPD, or there's more to it. What do you mean by that?
Well, to me, this is part of the debacle. Um, and you touched on it earlier, Bill, about this was kind of in the wake of the Rodney King incident, and I think so many things had happened from a prosecution point of view, a political point of view, which is kind of one of the same to a large degree, and even from law enforcement point of view. I think that so many entities bent over backwards to give OJ at least the public appearance of the benefit of the doubt. And to some degree, I can understand this, but to another, I think it was just a lack of leadership. So one example here is the change of venue.
Mhm.
And the venue, the court for this murder trial should have been Santa Monica Court. For those of you who don't are not familiar with Southern California, Santa Monica, of course, on the right on the beach, right on the water, the very west end of Los Angeles County, and that court would have covered the geographic area in which OJ lived in Brentwood. Um, that's where he would have been tried had the venue not been changed. But um, there was a call for a change of venue, and they moved it to downtown Los Angeles. The defense thought that they would get a more favorable jury, and we'll definitely talk about that. And that strategy obviously played out just the way that the defense wanted it. But that was one example of where I think that the prosecution slash Judge Ito um, made some egregious errors. He should have been tried in the jurisdiction in which he lived, a jury of your peers, in so many ways, as far as affluency, affluence, notoriety, um, all of these things. Where he was tried, it really was not a jury of his peers. The the second part of this is it's similar, but in any other case, that you and I can think of, Bill,
Mhm.
had any law enforcement agency felt that they had this kind of evidence to ask a suspected double murderer to turn themselves in, they wouldn't. In other words, if the evidence was that
Right.
strong that you say, this is our guy, as far as we're concerned, as far as evidence, you would issue an immediate warrant for his or her arrest. I don't know of any other case like this where a suspected double murderer or murderer or rapist, or you name any number of felonies, hey, turn yourself in. Those things do happen, but almost always they're of a nature of a non-public safety issue. Financial crimes, fraud, things like this, maybe, and those things happen, but not in a case like this. It's another example where I think in this case, where LAPD was saying, listen, we're going to treat you with kid gloves, OJ, and we want everybody in the world to see that we're doing this. This, all in my mind, has to do with Rodney King, because the DA, LAPD, of course, law enforcement in general, everybody got a bad name in that case.
Hmm.
and they wanted to write this with these types of tactics to make it look like they were treating him beyond fair.
Hmm. Yeah, that's interesting, and I agree with that. Um, I guess we're up to the trial, right? I
Mhm.
think a decision was made, which the detective. And I don't know, to hear the detectives talk since they talk about the prosecutors not being very communicative with them and explaining what the strategy was going to be. And you have to be on the same page, right? I mean, you and I know that when the prosecutors and the investigating officers have to be on the same page and have to share a common understanding about how the case is going to go forward. They're not always going to agree. I think when a few weeks back we talked to Joey Esposito, the former chief deputy at the LA County District Attorney's Office, and he talked about that. He talked about the necessity to have partnerships and communicate with the investigating agencies and be on the same page with them.
Mhm.
The prosecutors made the decision. Now let me ask you: the case was moved to from Santa Monica downtown. Was that not a function of just RHD doing the case, or like, or so how did it normally work? If because when I looked at it, I thought, oh, this is a high profile case. They're going to want it basically next door to the DA's office, and robbery homicide is a block the other direction from that prosecutor's office. Or is that just why they didn't? Is that why the prosecution didn't object very much to it? Maybe.
Well,
What's your feel?
it's an interesting question because there certainly was a logistical aspect to the change of venue. There's no doubt about that. And you gave me a chance here to explain the second part of this, in my opinion, Bill.
Hmm.
I think one of the reasons that um again, LAPD says, hey, we're gonna it communicates with OJ's attorneys, um and says he can turn himself in at this time. I think it was 11 o'clock in the morning. He's supposed to turn himself in. And I don't think there was much pushback against a change of venue. I said one of the reasons, logistical, certainly was easier probably for all the people involved, the LAPD detectives and prosecutors, things like this. But here's the other reason I think there wasn't much pushback and there was so much leeway given to OJ Simpson and his defense team and with these legalities. And that's because just like as I saw more and more evidence, I believe that the prosecutors believe they felt like any 9-year-old could see that OJ Simpson committed these murders. And there is no concession that we can make that will affect a jury to the point they're going to acquit this man. I believe that completely. And by the way, I think to a large extent it's very understandable because I felt and I feel the same way that any objective person could see that there is no off ramp from OJ Simpson's guilt in this case. There's not enough exculpatory evidence. There's nothing to indicate that he did not commit this crime. I believe Marsha Clark and the other prosecutors believe the same thing, and they felt that it was a slam dunk, and there was nothing they could do that was going to jeopardize the possibility of conviction of this man.
Here's the thing about that. I agree with you, but here's the thing about that. And I saw it in one high profile criminal case at DEA is so the prosecutors have the evidence, but they decided, Mark, to rely on a lot of DNA evidence. And this isn't DNA 2024. This is DNA 1994, something very new that had to be explained. And I'm going to say that they made the case too complex
I
for the
agree.
jury. One of the big issues is they made the case too complex for the jury. And here's and I'm interested to hear if you ever encountered this or have examples of this. I do, where we do this for a living, right? We look at evidence from a case and we can assess it right away and say, this is a solid case. But we're looking at it differently than a member of a jury, someone that doesn't have the law enforcement background, someone that's not been an IO, an investigator, like in this case, a homicide investigator can look at the evidence, assess it, and say, boom, this is what we got. Very difficult to take that, in my opinion, and transfer it to the minds of a jury in a way that they can easily understand and comprehend. And a lot of times, unfortunately, it's taken for granted that that's going to happen, and that just doesn't happen. The facts as they're seen by a detective or an agent or an officer and taken for granted almost as indicating one thing, it's sometimes, don't take for granted the fact that the prosecutor can successfully explain that and pass that expertise and knowledge onto a juror so they can say, oh yeah, we see that, we understand that. Um, is that something that you encountered ever where there's things that cops take for granted that are actually very difficult to explain and for jurors to make sense of?
Well, yes. And I'll say this, Bill. I think that a lot of times, and listen, there are a lot of times that I got done with a trial, and I'm thinking, how did the prosecutor mess this up? In other
Hmm.
words, this, you know, th- he, she, they made it so difficult, and this, there's a much more efficient way to explain something. Um, I think in this case with the DNA, and I do think that it was very complicated. As I watched it, but I think at the time, Bill, it was a double-edged sword. It still is, I think, because DNA can prove or disprove um, something. But at the
Right.
time, DNA, even though it was still brand new, it was still out there. And the question was, which side here, the prosecution or the defense, who was going to be the lead with this? Who was going to take this and drive the case with the DNA? Because it was going to pop up one way or the other. There's no doubt about it. It was going to come up. And so I don't think the prosecution had any choice other than to use it. Now, having said that, um, I agree with you 100%. They made it so complicated and I'm watching this and I'm getting a headache. Um, on my days off, I watched the trial like everybody else. I was very interested in it, and I said, "Look, I believe the guy did it, but man, you're talking about this and PCR and blah blah blah, blah, blah,
I
blah,
know.
blah, blah."
Yeah.
Very very complicated, and I think eventually the eyes of the jury probably were glazing over on this evidence altogether.
And here's what happened, Mark, because of, and you mentioned it already, because of the Rodney King sentiment, especially toward LAPD, they didn't want to put cops on the stand to bring evidence in.
Mhm.
That's the bottom line. They tried to avoid using police officers, detectives to bring evidence in. Now they did, obviously they had to, but they tried to rely more on the science of DNA and those witnesses to bring the case home. And I don't think that was kind of well received. And I think, the limited, the LAPD witnesses they did put on, there were some problems with them. And, we'll get into that. But the, they left out a lot of powerful circumstantial evidence, like the woman who saw OJ driving away from the scene,
Big
like
mistake.
yeah, big mistake. And they left that stuff out in favor of the DNA evidence because, in their mind, the DNA evidence is black and white. It can't be misinterpreted. It's science. We have probabilities and statistics to show that the chances of it not being OJ Simpson are 1 in a billion in one case. But the reality is, if that stuff is so damn hard to understand, especially at that time, that I think it was lost on a lot of people. And, um, maybe the defense really took a more simpler strategy and just really put the cops on trial. Their thing was, let's put LAPD on trial and see what we can make happen. Another thing that I've heard the detectives say was unfortunate in the case was it had to do with the testimony of Cato Caitlin.
Mhm.
Um, not the best witness, Mark, not the best witness, but to this day, he and Tom Lang, I don't want to say they're friends, but they have social interactions. I've seen him appear on different shows. Uh, Tom Lang doesn't disparage Cato Caitlin. what Tom Lang, the detective, is frustrated with is that Cato was declared a hostile witness, and making it seem like he wasn't going to be believable almost. And I think that was frustrating for the LAPD detectives. And the other thing is, according to Cato, is he has no exposure to the criminal justice system. In his defense, he got prepped, and then he got prepped by the prosecution. He was called by the prosecution as a witness, and then, according to him, Marcia Clark kind of went off script and started asking him stuff that they didn't prep for, and he just wasn't prepared for that. And
Right.
hey, I've seen that happen with law enforcement people, Mark, when the trial prep is not good, and testimony can go off the rails pretty quick. So I don't know if you had any thoughts about Cato or his contributions at the trial, or what happened at the trial with him.
I think that you know I want to be kind here because I don't know the man personally,
Mhm,
but I just don't think that he was the strongest witness in the sense that he I believe he's sure of what he heard, but I think that he was, what he witnessed, but I think that he was um, easily manipulated on the stand.
mhm,
I
mhm,
think that he wasn't the strongest of personality, and when I say that, what I mean is your ability is to stand your ground. I guess here's what I remember, here's what I saw, and here's what I can't remember. And we all forget stuff. That's, if anybody says that's not true, then they're lying to you. We can't remember everything. But what you remember are the big issues. Remember the big pictures about, hey, this is what happened as far as I can recall to the best of my ability. Um, we've all dealt with witnesses. There's not a perfect witness. Um, but I think that Cato Kalin falls in the category of a weak witness.
mhm,
And now, when you combine his testimony with other people, we talked about the limo driver, we talked about the woman in the intersection who almost got hit by OJ with the car, things like this. Then his testimony becomes more powerful. But let's face it, the job of a defense attorney, the defense team, is to diminish the credibility of the opposition whenever they can and make the jury have second guesses. And I think they did that very well with Cato Kalin.
A couple other things I want to touch on at the trial, Mark, and these are the things that I think, two things that I think um, really sealed the fate of this trial, right? And one was the testimony of Dennis Fung. He
Yes.
was the criminologist, right?
Yes.
And this gets back a little bit to the Rodney King thing where, and I'm going to ask you, Mark, the reports in the Rodney King incident, let's say that CHP wrote or that LAPD wrote,
Mhm.
were they written before that video came out? Do you remember?
I don't remember. So Highway Patrol and LAPD in this regard, we generally work a little different. But in other words, but this is to LAPD's defense. They generally write complete investigations in a very timely manner. Generally, obviously, there are exceptions, but this is from my recollection, my involvement with LAPD. So, the Highway Patrol may or may not have completed its part of
Mm,
that. The pursuit investigation, by the way, I know it's a little bit of a sidetrack here, but the pursuit part of it's a different type of investigation, and that takes quite a bit of time for the Highway Patrol to do. But the other part of it, the use of force investigation by LAPD, I'm not sure if they completed that. When they completed it, I know generally they're pretty timely with those types of investigations.
Here's why I asked that. And I know, I had this experience when I worked at DEA where there was reports that were written that documented things happening at a certain time, let's say, right? And there was videotape. Now, the time, you know how a timestamp on a video, this is
Mhm.
back in the old days with video cameras where you set the time. The timestamp was set incorrectly, wrong date, wrong time. So that wasn't an issue. And I think I might have told this story on here once before, but as this video was being recorded, there was a television playing in the background. And you saw a TV show on the television playing in the background. The defense actually subpoenaed the network that was showing that particular program and got the raw run of that program. So they were able to say what specific time, down to the second, that scene that was on the TV played. And that did not match with the times that were in the report that was written. And that caused a serious issue with the prosecution of a case. And that case was dismissed. And, there was an investigation of the personnel involved, et cetera, whether it was purposeful or on and on. But I bring that up because it's extremely important to maintain credibility of law enforcement that the reports and your statements are factually accurate. Now, what happened with Dennis Fong is the defense was trying to make a big issue, and rightly so, that's their job, about contamination of blood evidence. We talked about a glove that had OJ's blood, Nicole's blood, Ron Goldman's blood. The Bronco had their blood in it. All this blood was everywhere. So when they are cross-examining the criminologist, Dennis Fong, there's basic discussion about, are you wearing gloves? Are you wearing gloves when you collect these samples? Yes, I am. Do you change gloves? How frequently do you change gloves? So one of the things he stated on the stand was, I was wearing gloves when I collected this evidence at Bundy. And guess what? They have video that was shot from news media across the street, and he was not wearing gloves. Did he forget? Who knows? Who knows why he made that statement? But it turned out not to be factually correct. And when the person collecting the blood evidence, when they're making an issue of contaminating blood evidence, and he says, no, it's not contaminated because I was wearing gloves, I changed gloves, whatever his exact testimony was, Mark, I don't recall, but I do remember that he said he was wearing gloves. The video showed he was not wearing gloves. That is a major, major issue. And that's tough to recover from, because the jury sees it and they say, well, he's not, this is the guy that took the blood samples. And again, DNA 1994, contamination, I don't think anyone's too clear on exactly what's what. He's saying he did one thing. It turns out he didn't. That might be reasonable doubt right there. I want to hear your thoughts on that. But then the second thing, which I feel really, I'm going to be honest, Mark. I mean, I think I've seen cases just outright dismissed for situations like this. Now, that is Mark Furhman. There was the cross-examination by F. Lee Bailey, and there was, they attempted to paint him as a racist. And they asked him about, had he ever made, let's say, racially disparaging comments? No, I haven't. And it turns out that there was a, what is it? A
Producer,
movie guy.
Yeah.
What was it?
Writing a screenplay or
screenplay? Yeah, a screenplay writer or something that had recordings of him, and he in fact did use, let's call it, racially disparaging, inappropriate, racist language, whatever you want to call it. I'm probably not doing it, explaining it properly. But fact of the matter is, I don't know whether that was like, I don't know the context of it. Not that it really matters. But was it a fictional thing that they were working on or whatever? But also in this screenplay thing, he talked about how easy it would be for a police officer to get away with murder, right, and a couple other things. When he's asked, Mark, have you ever did you plant evidence in this case, in this homicide case, or in any other homicide investigation? And what does he say? I take the fifth.
Right.
I mean, I don't see that. That's tough to recover from, Mark. When the police officer who finds the glove on Rockingham that has the 3 blood types on it, and it's OJ's glove, the other glove, the matching glove of the set is at the crime scene, and he's asked if he's ever planted evidence, and he takes the fifth to protect himself from potential self-incrimination.
Right.
What's the jury supposed to think, Mark? We like, what I'm saying is that you kind of have to be better than that. And what is a jury supposed to think when the defense is making allegations of misconduct, of planting evidence, and that's the response you get from your witness? Where else does the jury go?
Well, there's so much to be said about this, and of course, it was devastating to the prosecution, obviously. And Marsha Clark, you can see her interview now. She's still, I think, she has cursing fits about Mark Furhman. She's still so angry about it 30 years later. The first thing is about taking the fifth. I believe when he was asked about, have you ever planted evidence, and I'm going to invoke my Fifth Amendment right, well, whatever. I believe that was in the same line of questioning, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Bill, is when he was asked, later on after it came out that he actually had used this disparaging racist language. It was that same line of questioning. Have you ever used this word? And I'm going to invoke my Fifth Amendment right. I believe was the same time they also asked him in that chain, that questioning, have you ever planted evidence? Now, if I'm wrong on that, folks, please send me comments and straighten me out. But I believe it was all the same. In other words, you're not able, once you invoke your Fifth Amendment right, if they ask you your name again, you say, oh, it's so-and-so. Now you have waived your right. You have to answer everything at that point. So in other words, it's you have waived your right to Fifth Amendment protection. So now you can be held in contempt and things like this. So I don't know if what that means, but what it looks like is when you say, I'm going to invoke my Fifth Amendment right, it looks like, yeah, I've planted evidence before. And that's exactly what it looks like to the jury. I couldn't agree more. So It was devastating. Now, I will say something else about this bill is that if you have a set of jurors who, in my opinion, voted the way they did with this trial, with OJ Simpson, there was nothing that Mark Furhman could have said, could not have said, or any other witness that could have done anything to have them vote to convict OJ Simpson. And I know I'm getting ahead of the game here, but Mark Furhman was about the worst case scenario for this prosecution team. About the worst case scenario. I totally agree. But what it means is this, is that everything else that pointed to the guilt of OJ Simpson must have been disregarded if you're going to hang your hat on this one witness as a jury.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean,
again, look, there's no way around it. And it could not have been a worst case scenario for the prosecution.
Right.
There's no way around it.
And I mean, hey, we know juries, the jury, it's almost like you don't get to, if you can't get past the letter C, you're never going to get to Z. And I think that, when the defense says, here's what we say happened in this case, and the witness plays right into it, I mean, it's hard to get past that. It doesn't, what I'm saying is it doesn't matter how much other evidence there is. It really doesn't matter how much other evidence there is. And like I said, I've seen cases get dropped where there was other evidence, but it's almost like, it's so bad at that point that they're just going to cut their losses and move on. So I think that those two pieces, the criminologist and Mark Furhman, as much as we want to say, hey, like you just said, Mark, like you're saying, hey, the jury would have acquitted him no matter what. I don't know. I can't say that, because what I'm saying is the prosecution made it pretty easy. The way the case was put on, it made it pretty easy for them to acquit. And I don't think they got to a lot of the other stuff either by choice or because they just couldn't get past these bad witnesses. I don't know. To talk real quick about where the specific corruption allegations were, and there were some kind of weird things that happened. But hey, that weird things happen all the time, and that doesn't mean that doesn't mean there's police misconduct. It's just how an investigation goes. One of the things was blood drops on the back gate of the Bundy residence, right? It wasn't found until 3 weeks after the crime. And, the criminologist, there was a bunch of people at the scene. The criminologist went through everything. They didn't find it till 3 weeks later. That's strange, but hey, that's what happens. And I guess that was OJ's blood. It turned out that was OJ's blood. The sock there was a sock found in OJ's house, and I don't know if there was not initially blood found on it, and that wasn't realized till later on that there was blood on the sock or whatever it was. And this one, I don't know. This one's a weird one because the defense had a forensic expert testify that the blood stain had gone from one side of the sock through to the other side, and he said it would be impossible for that to happen if the sock was actually worn by somebody.
Right.
So his contention was that blood was planted on there. And again, that's a very simple assertion that might resonate with the juror, or it could be the sock was taken off and the blood was still wet, and when it was on the floor, the blood soaked through to the other side. You know what I mean? But I don't know how much the prosecution kind of pushed back or tried to correct some of those things. But anything else, Mark, on the blood evidence where they made
Well, the
allegations
blood
of
evidence,
corruption? That's
Dennis Fong, I think that is, in other words, this is a really good example for me of a place where the defense legitimately focused on with the lack of wearing gloves, or not the whole time. In other words, hey, you said you wore gloves. You say you changed them a lot. Yes, I do. Yes, I did. It's whatever. Well, here's videotape of you not wearing gloves. And that's completely legitimate because it's simply not deniable that it didn't happen. The question is where is the mindset of Dennis Fong? In other words, if his general routine is to wear gloves and change them, and he's there all day or a couple of days, whatever it is, and then you get a few seconds or even a couple of minutes here and there where he's walking around, he's carrying a bag, and he doesn't have gloves on, could that happen legitimately to somebody? Could they forget that they didn't? I think so. But in other words, it's legitimate from both points of view. I think that he could legitimately forget just out of kind of habit, routine, that he didn't have gloves on every single second. I mean, he's carrying his evidence bags or maybe even collecting evidence. He just forgot in between or whatever because he's been doing it for years. Listen, for the longest time, I was concerned after one particular incident that I hope I didn't pick up any type of a communicable disease out of the scene, because I was dealing with somebody who was bleeding profusely, and I was an EMT at the time. And the routine, put the gloves on. And I, quote unquote, always did put my gloves on, always did. But in this particular case, in the heat of the moment, I'm in there working on this victim in the middle of the freeway, and this person's squirting blood all over the place. And I look down, I go, holy crap. I didn't say crap. And I'm completely ungloved. And here's what's worse about it. At the time, I was racing bicycles, and I had crashed, I don't know, about a week later. And I had some pretty good wounds on my hand that were open. And so that's why for a long time I was worried, oh my God, I hope I don't come down with something. But the point is, it wasn't until minutes into the scene where I realized I had not done what I always do. And maybe if I hadn't realized it that second and forgotten about it, or I didn't have the cuts on my hand, someone asked me a week later or the day after, did you have gloves on? I might have said, yeah, because I always put gloves on, but in that case, I just forgot. So, but here's the thing for a jury bill. It's a long way from violating protocol and potentially contaminating a crime scene to a willful, intentional planting of evidence. It's a long stretch. You have to have a whole lot of people at multiple crime scenes, including vehicles, to engage in the type of behavior that the defense claimed happened. The last thing I'll say on this particular thing, you talk about the prosecution making mistakes and Judge Ito making mistakes. Oh my God, they're endless. Before it happened, when we as the viewing audience, so to speak, found out that they were going to have OJ Simpson try on the gloves, I thought, I said, this is a mistake I remember this. I said, are they crazy? And my first thought was, you've already testified, all these witnesses have already testified that both gloves are soaked in blood. And I'm thinking, what, a year later now, you're going to pull these things out of evidence? They're probably crucified like,
Mm-hmm.
like an Egyptian mummy. And you're going to have somebody try to put these gloves on. Who's to say this leather hasn't shrunk and things like this? And then when I'm watching this, what does he have on first? Latex gloves?
That's the worst part of it right there.
How do you plan to have leather slide over latex gloves? So as this was unfolding, I'm sitting there in front of my television thinking, no
Yeah.
kidding, they won't fit.
Yeah.
They wouldn't
Bonehead
fit
move.
if his hands were half the size now. And
No,
all that
that's-
did was play into the prosecution, which resulted in the world famous, if they don't fit, you must acquit. And it's like,
Yep.
duh.
Yep. And I thought the same thing, man. I mean, I know people can relate to just trying to put on latex gloves, how sticky they are, trying to get a latex glove on your hand. The outside of it is just as sticky as the inside. Now you're trying to put that over some crusted leather and doesn't work.
Yep.
Doesn't work. I don't know, Mark. I think today, I think the trial probably goes the same way, though, Mark. And I say that because, so do you think today there's not that distrust level, or did things change in 1992, 1991, and the expectations on law enforcement became different? Or I guess what I'm getting at, the Rodney King fallout, the public perception of what law enforcement is, how law enforcement handles things. Do you think today that prosecution with that evidence and those witnesses goes any different? Because I don't. I don't think it goes any different. I think today, I don't want to say, conspiracy-minded people, but I think today people look at it and say, they're going to have the same issues. Like, you almost have to do a better job of anticipating what those problems are going to be. Or was it because this was really the first time in a major case that law enforcement was put on trial that you can recall?
Well, I'll say this to your first question. I don't know what would happen today. I don't know. And what that translates to for me, Bill, is I'm very, very disappointed in how I see our judicial system today. In other words, I should know that today a jury will look at the same evidence you and I are looking at and say, oh yeah, this is slam dunk. But I don't know. I don't have the answer. Why are we here? Well, I think this really does, not completely, but I think to a large degree that this does stem from the Rodney King case. And I'm going to give you an example here. And I've forgotten her name, but anybody can look at the video of this one juror saying this. So it's out there, not making this up. But one of the juries admits, she said that 90% of the jurors, the OJ jurors, including herself, voted not guilty as a payback for Rodney King. Now, she said that. And maybe we can put a clip up there, Anthony, Vince, and of her saying that. So we have to assume, based on what she said. Now, again, I guess she can't speak for the other jurors, but she's speaking for herself for sure. And if she's right, that 90% of them felt that way, and then basically that leaves you about 2 or 3 other jurors that you have to persuade. And by the way, the story is that there was one juror, it was one white, I believe, female on there. There were 10 women on this jury. And the white female on there was the holdout, if I remember correctly, for a little while. And then finally
It was only
caved,
3 hours, right? Wasn't the deliberation was only
something like that. It was a matter of hours. And so, but when you look back, when you have a juror say that I voted to acquit as payback for the Rodney King case, we have to assume that this was a significant change with potential jurors, and in this case, in this capacity, specifically Black jurors, because they're talking about racial payback and in their mind, racial injustice that has occurred. But I got to say this, when I remember again, where I was the morning after these murders occurred. I remember exactly where I was when the verdict came in. I was actually in a funeral procession for a retired CHP officer,
Mm.
who unfortunately had died in a traffic collision, ironically, about 2 months after he retired. It was so tragic.
Mm.
And on the freeway that he used to patrol, we were beat partners. And anyway, I was in that funeral procession, and we're driving black and white, my partner and I, and I had a little AM radio carrying in my CHP Mustang. I'm driving, and my buddy Ed is listening to the verdict, and he just says, "Not guilty." And it was surreal. It was surreal. When we got back from the funeral, got back to the station, another black officer, um, he was walking out of the station. He was a motor officer getting ready to get on his motor. And I'm walking from the back parking lot into the office to the station. And we crossed paths in the hallway. Didn't say a word. Did not say a word. We walked past each other. And before he went outside, he goes, "Garrett." And I turned around and said, what's up, Carl? And again, just another black officer. And he's sitting like this, shaking his head. He said, "Mark, what have we done today?" And he was talking from the perspective of black people. And I said, "Carl, I don't know. I don't know." And he was prophetic with that question about, in other words, what tone have we set now that is all payback? And it's not to dismiss the horrible injustices that have happened to my ancestors, to my parents, not to dismiss that at all. But the question is, what does any individual now do with the reality that in their own personal lives or as a culture, as a race, that they have been dealt injustices? What do you do moving forward? Do you engage in the same kind of behavior that you had to fight for forever, for so long, for hundreds of years? Or do you judge people on an individual basis, whether in your personal life or in a criminal sense? Do you judge them based on what they have done, not what their ancestors or your ancestor did or had done for you? And that's exactly what Carl meant when he asked that question 29 years ago now, because that was 1995. And I said,
Right.
I don't know. So I still don't know, Carl. Carl. I still don't know, Bill, what this means moving forward. I don't know what a jury would do today with the same evidence. It's a little bit hard to talk about because evidence would be different now with technology that we
Yeah.
have. But with the
Yeah.
same evidence, I am not confident that anybody like OJ Simpson or the same case, I'm not sure that he would be convicted today.
Right. I think you wrapped it up perfectly there at the end, Mark. I don't know how we can really add anything of value after that. The justice system in this country can never be about payback. It has to be individualized accountability for individual actions. And that's definitely part of what acquitted OJ Simpson of the murder of Nicole Simpson and Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman. Um, hopefully, law enforcement's learned from it, um, and remembers that a lot of the things, like you talked about the criminologist and how he did his everyday activities and probably wore gloves 99% of the time, but still you have to be factually accurate in what you say and be able to explain shortcomings and acknowledge them and just move on. And the behavior of law enforcement in this one left a little something to be desired, and especially when a key witness takes the fifth, and the way the prosecution put on the case, the perfect storm from all three sides, I think, Mark.
I agree.
Folks, that's it on the OJ Simpson case. Follow both of these podcasts, Truth Nation podcast and Your Leo Nation. A lot of topical issues brought to you courtesy of the Chief, Mark Garrett, and I. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you soon.